On this episode of TLC Connections, we sit down with Reverend Jeremy Montgomery, CEO of Philly House, Philadelphia's oldest and largest homeless shelter for men. With a 146-year legacy, Philly House has served thousands of men in need, providing food, shelter, and critical support services. Jeremy shares the realities of homelessness, the challenges of mental health care, and the power of restoring broken relationships. He also reflects on his own journey and what drives his passion for serving others. It's a conversation about hope, dignity, and real solutions to a growing crisis. We hope you enjoy the episode.
Welcome to TLC Connections, the podcast where educators, counselors, coaches, and community leaders come together to inspire change, one connection at a time.
Jeremy Montgomery, CEO of the Philly House. Tell us a little bit about the Philly House.
Philly House has only been around for 146 years.
Only,
yeah. So legal name still is the Sunday Breakfast Association of Philadelphia. So we were founded in 1878 by some very famous Philadelphians to offer breakfast on Sunday before church. And so what began as a coffee and a roll before church in 1878, today we are Philadelphia's oldest and largest homeless shelter. And we're also the only 3 meals a day, 365 days of the year, serving meals to the public. So last year, we served 108,000 meals. And we also sheltered 2,042 unique, unduplicated men, representing about a third of all single men in the city of Philadelphia.
So homeless shelter, specifically for men.
Specifically and only for men. Yep.
Okay. I want to just, for the listeners, just talk a little bit about nomenclature here. And I know you and I have talked about this before.
Yep.
Homeless shelter is certainly common, is the most common term. However, some have said that it's not necessarily the most accurate term. My wife and I just recently spent some time in Nashville, and we met a person that was on the street, and we started a conversation with this man. He had served in the military for many years and had traditional housing for decades, lost his house, and was currently living in his car. And he had approval from a neighbor to park his car on his neighbor's property. But he considered that his home. So he didn't consider himself homeless, although he didn't have traditional housing. So just for the listeners, homeless, we're going to use homeless as kind of a very generic term.
Yep.
Other terms that are being used, and some are advocating that we use these terms more often, are houseless, unhoused, unsheltered. We are referring to it as just the lack of traditional housing. Tell us about the typical male that comes through the Philly House.
Yeah. First of all, even just a quick comment on nomenclature. What's important to me, we do try to follow a trauma-informed care approach. And so, everyone who walks through our doors have experienced trauma. Because homelessness, however you want to nomenclature call it, is traumatic.
Yeah.
So that's our first viewpoint. And so from a trauma-informed care approach and model, whatever nomenclature that you and I use, to me, the only one that really matters is the one experiencing homelessness. What do they think? How do they view themselves? And so sometimes, these conversations about nomenclature can be somewhat ivory tower elitist, right? Yeah. Where the guys that we serve, they don't care. They view themselves with one word to describe themselves. They're homeless.
Yeah.
They're homeless, right?
Yeah.
So we get the question all the time too, GT, so who are these guys that we serve? And we can really kind of divide it into three, what I often refer to as 3 buckets or 3 categories. The first one is just the disadvantaged poor. And many of these men are working full-time jobs, but they can't afford to be able to live on their own. And so they walk through our doors because they don't want to sleep on a park bench. They've perhaps even exhausted savings in a motel because circumstances led for them being able to be evicted or perhaps kicked out or divorced, and therefore kicked out of their home. And again, they have already enough dignity, enough respect for themselves to not want to be unsheltered, unhoused, living out on a street or in a car, right? So the working poor, the disadvantaged. The next category bucket is oftentimes the mentally ill. And then the third one would be those struggling with substance use disorder. And so even within those three categories and buckets, there's crossovers where certainly an individual, a single man, could fit all three, right? And oftentimes, when we look at and we consider the causes of homelessness, it's often not substance use disorder. Substance use disorder often can be the symptom of what really began to be just being unhoused and homeless. And that's the symptom. Whereas, they become homeless, they're perhaps living out on the street, and then using substances and using drugs then therefore becomes the insulator, the self-medicated way to be able to cope with that trauma, right? And I'm not saying that with every case. I mean, certainly substance use disorder, especially here in Philadelphia and the area of Kensington, and Kensington is considered the nation's largest open-air drug market, particularly during the summer. There's a lot of people from all over the world who flock to Kensington specifically for its access to cheap drugs.
Yeah.
And then mental health, I mean, it's been well documented, and people, I think, associate many that are unhoused or homeless in Philadelphia with the mental health challenges, and we see that.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Let's go just a little bit deeper into Philly House. Can you describe real quick just the main services that are provided? So obviously food, shelter, and mental health support, case management. Am I missing anything?
Case management, and then what we call case conferencing.
Okay.
And so we can break that down in a second. So we fundamentally describe what we do even from Maslow's hierarchy of need, right? Food, water, shelter, and Maslow just identified what are the basic human needs. If people are not familiar with it, it is basically the model that we follow, in which the basic human need is food, water, shelter. So guys are coming through our door, and women, by the way, because we also serve meals to women and children and families. So our meal program is not just for men. And that's the most basic need. The next one above that is safety and security. So when you consider the homeless services that we provide, it's to help one to reestablish a sense of personal safety and security. So there's a lot of arguments against even our approach of using metal detectors, using cameras, because we don't want it to feel like prison. But the other side of it, listen, you can't go through TSA lines or airports or even public municipal buildings without some type of safety and security. And that is why most walk through our doors, and why we serve about a third is because they feel safe.
Can't even watch a football game without going through metal detectors.
That's right. And so sense of belonging is the next human need. And that with that comes a self-esteem. So from our trauma-informed approach, I mean, everything we do is to help to stabilize somebody and to be able to reestablish and meet those basic human needs. And so you reference case management. Our practice also includes case conferencing. And that's where on a weekly basis, we review every man that is in our building and in our shelter on a weekly basis to identify what their next steps are in terms of stability. And so this is a multi-prong approach where our entire homeless services team come together and go through a spreadsheet of up to 150 men every week to be able to identify what are the next steps. And so we have a spiritual care coordinator that's part of that. We have our case managers. We also have a drug and alcohol counselor that's part of that, and then our director of homeless services. And what we have found is that a particular individual will share their story and say one thing to our spiritual care coordinator, but then share a different story with our case manager, right? And then share another story sitting in the office with the director of homeless services. And so as a team, they come together to put together the pieces of that puzzle of who this guy is, right? And why he walks through our doors. And then to be able to help him to address those barriers and to be able to lead to stability, if you will. So case conferencing for us is actually a unique contribution. So you can walk into a lot of homeless shelters and they may provide a form of case management. And in most shelters, that's just simply helping one to navigate the resources, right? Resources. So our fundamental resource that we help a guy with is with their government IDs. So about 2 out of every 3 men who walk through our doors don't have identification. And so therefore they have no identity in our society. And so we help them to reestablish birth certificates as well as any other government ID that they can reclaim. And without that, I mean, they're not getting housing, they're not getting public benefits, they're not able to get a job or anything like that. And so we know when a guy sits in front of our case managers, GT, that's their number one need.
Right.
Reestablish their identity. And so that's the fundamental question we ask a guy is, have you done that? Right. And if one has not done that within their first 30 days of their stay, we exit them.
Okay.
We actually dismiss them. So we have an expectation of participation. Well, we're not going to do the work of being able to recover that ID, but we certainly walk alongside them with our case management.
Okay. Obviously, there's a crisis, homelessness crisis in many urban cities. So at a macro level, are we making a difference? Are the NGOs, the Philly Houses of the World, is the problem getting better or worse?
Worse. So last year, homelessness rose 18% here in the United States, 18%. The prior year, it was 22%. The crisis of homelessness is getting worse because of those 2 categories that I referenced earlier, mental health and the decline of mental health. That population is growing and growing and growing. And same thing with those that are struggling with substance use disorder.
What are your thoughts on the causes of, if you ask the 5 whys, to get down to the root cause, what's behind the increase in mental health disorders and substance abuse?
The why. Recently, it was brought to my attention that for decades, a facility with more than 16 beds cannot receive Medicaid to be able to treat mental illness. And so if you consider, if our medical facilities, not mental, our medical facilities was limited to only 16 beds, how big of a crisis would we have medically in terms of physical ailments on our streets today, right? And so that to me is astounding that's been the restriction on our books for decades. But we've got to find a way to still be able to, on a mass level, to be able to treat those struggling with mental illness by allowing great organizations, perhaps like the Lincoln Center, Philly House, or all the other providers, to be able to access federal funding and that type of reimbursement by providing more than 16 beds.
Yeah. Your background, your educational background also includes business as
Yes.
well.
Yes.
How's an MBA? So a lot of times when people go the counseling, social work, at least from an formal educational perspective, it's all focused on that. Or people who go the business route tend to stay in that lane, end up working in banks,
right,
and financial services, CFOs, accountant types in corporate America. You have a unique background and you have both. You
Both.
have this calling.
Seminary degree,
yeah.
studying theology and
Yeah.
learning Koine Greek.
And then learning T accounts and accounting class and finance.
Right.
So how has that helped you?
Yeah.
I'm assuming it helps, or I guess
Absolutely.
the question would be, has it hindered you in any way? But how is an MBA and the financial acumen that you learned in post-grad, how's that help run Philly House?
Yeah. I mean, it's what I use every day, and that's the big joke I use with people is on the business finance side, I usually give a wink and I said, of course, seminary taught me all that. And so I went back to get my MBA when I was still at First Baptist Church of Westfield. And so, I'm a pastor of a bunch of MBA types that work Wall Street. And when I first enrolled into business school to get my MBA, I'd get knocks on the door, from these MBAs and be like, hey, what's this? You've joined business school. I thought you were called to the ministry.
Yeah.
Like, should I be expecting your resume anytime soon? Like, what's going on, pal? Right. And so at the time I had to just quickly realize and formulate this simple response, which is still true to this day, where I said, listen, modern ministry, 21st century ministry that I want to be a part of is business management and business administration. So I do describe myself as now the equilibrium between even two extremes, one being ministry, one being social service, which has a different side of the brain you even use, and that other side is business. And so I even always like to find the equilibrium and the balance of the two, right? And GT, you serve on my board, the board of directors for Philly House, and I even need board members from both extremes. I need those that have the business acumen, but I also need the ones that have the big heart, that just want to give it all away and do everything we can do out of compassion. And oftentimes some conflicts within nonprofit organizations is the conflict between both when you need both.
Right.
And so bringing that equilibrium of that pendulum back to balance and let both types of individuals understand that we need the perspective of both.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And one of the skills that are taught in MBA programs is not just the accounting and finance, but just leadership, organizational leadership, how to lead, right? How to influence to others towards a common mission to get something done.
Yeah. So back to the knocks on the door that I would get, right?
Yeah.
What they told me, and then when I said modern ministry is management, was like awesome, because they warned me, and I would say this is what an MBA does. They said, so be careful and just be aware. It's going to change the way you think and the way you perceive the world.
Yeah.
Right? From a financial spreadsheet, even quantitative way. And that's probably one of the more fascinating courses I took is quantitative decision making.
Yeah, data-driven decision making.
Data-driven.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the reason I brought that up, I knew you had your MBA. The reason I brought it up is to go back to the question about the root cause, the 5 whys of this problem.
Yeah.
Is ultimately, I can make an argument that ultimately you peel back the onion and the root cause is a failure of leadership at some level to address the crises. In the corporate world, you have a crisis, you put together a management team, you solve it, you solve the problem. And so this problem is complex and multi-pronged and involves leadership, but particularly in the political realm. What do you see politically with things that have either helped or hindered the problem from? I don't want to necessarily get into politics. Politics can be divisive, so let's avoid specifics and specific politicians. But just generally speaking, what are your thoughts on, is there the political will to solve this nationally or locally in terms of mayors and governors?
Yes and no. It's actually both. It's both and. And I do have reporters call me often to field my viewpoint of what a new presidential administration could bring, or even for both good or bad. And recently, even in an interview with a reporter with the Philadelphia Inquirer, I brought it down to this level. Honestly, the men that we serve all throughout the election of November 2024, that election and politics never come up. They're not concerned about it. They don't think about it. Again, back that Maslow's hierarchy of need. And so from a national level, some of the issues that we're also having is a one-size-fits-all approach to housing, and it's what's called housing first. And so housing first is a philosophy that says that the first thing that any individual needs is that housing component. And so they put them right into an apartment. So first of all, to produce that affordable housing unit is incredibly expensive. For most cities that have, homeless issues, I mean, you're talking about $450,000 per unit to be able to produce that. So the housing first model says just stick them in there and then provide them with wraparound services in order to be able to then address the other root causes that exist. Well, that approach, frankly, in most municipalities throughout our nation is bankrupting us. It's too expensive, number one. Number two, the data is still not out to prove that it succeeds. In fact, in those housing first units are the most overdoses. There are more deaths in those housing first units than there are in shelters and even on the streets. And so what sometimes results is an isolation. So you put somebody in their own home and all of a sudden they're completely isolated and alone and frankly somewhat expected to now be able to make it and survive and succeed. So before the housing first approach, it's what was referred to as a continuum of care. And so it took a graduated approach to that permanent housing unit. And that's the approach that we at Philly House follow. So it's shelter first, and that's an emergency shelter. And that type of situation, even in terms of its physical living condition, is meant to be emergency. Similar to walking into the hospital, GT, they're not putting you into a hospital room. You're walking into the emergency department, right? And there's going to triage you. They're going to assess you, diagnose you, see what's wrong. And if it's a headache, they're saying, dude, go home. Right. So that's what we do at Philly House. We're a triage center to try to stabilize somebody within a 30-day period enough to be able to then graduate them or move them into more transitional settings. And so those transitional settings are often addiction recovery programs. It's working with partners for workforce development.
Yep.
It's for seniors, particularly seniors. We see a lot of seniors come through our doors. So about 21% of all the men that we're serving are senior citizens. And so with them, it's getting them to transitional units. And so it's a continuum of care to be able to ultimately then lead to something permanent. But we're certainly not wanting to stick a guy straight into a housing first unit without first stabilizing and addressing those root causes.
Yeah. You just mentioned the word partners, which made me think of another question here. The question is, what role does collaboration with other organizations or businesses play within the Philly House? And obviously, in the spirit of full disclosure, the Lincoln Center has a partnership with Philly House as well, providing substance abuse counseling. But just talk about it at a higher level, just collaboration. You know, the old cliche, it takes a village, right?
Yeah.
And because this is a complex problem, it takes multiple organizations collaborating with one another, moving towards accomplishing a shared vision and mission. So your thoughts on partners?
Partners are absolutely key to everything we do. And the philosophy and approach that I bring to Philly House during the last 6 years is to implement what's referred to as systems thinking. So when I went to seminary, Gordon Conwell, that urban ministry program really focused on Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline.
Yep.
And
I reread that just recently.
It's a phenomenal book. And so, then when you consider an urban area, especially homelessness, that sort of thing, I mean, that foundational educational, let's just say leaning and influence allows me to be able to see what we do as part of a bigger system. And so I refuse to allow Philly House to offer any type of program or services that otherwise is being provided by someone else in our city. So Philadelphia is the fifth largest city in the United States. There's a lot of potential partners for us to be able to ensure that we don't ultimately duplicate and replicate what someone else is probably an expert at.
Right.
So under my leadership, that's why we double down on shelter. And that's why we are effective at being able to get a guy off the street and help him to navigate to these other partnerships. And so our partners are long, and as the needs are long, because every individual is different. And so there's not a unique story or a unique thing that somebody may need, but we are getting better and better and better of developing those partnerships and collaborations to connect them. Connections is one of your themes, right? To connect them to those resources.
Yep.
And so, for example, once upon a time, we felt the need to develop our own addiction recovery program in Philly House. We found a very successful one down in Baltimore called Helping Up Mission. Even the governor of Maryland at one point declared it to be the most effective addiction recovery program in that state. So that's why we went down there. Well, today, they're one of our partners. And so instead of replicating their model, we decided not to do that because their model wouldn't fit in our physical location. We have an MOU with them in which we transport men down to their program. So they have a campus of about 650. And it's a powerful, powerful force for our men then to enter that type of community of treatment and recovery. And so Helping Up Mission, why they're effective, is they have a partnership and a collaboration with the Johns Hopkins University Hospital. So Johns Hopkins have embedded a clinic in that rescue mission to be able to handle all the mental health issues and challenges. Right. So these guys are getting top line, top shelf, state-of-the-art, world-renowned therapy, while then the rescue mission does the spiritual aspects of it in terms of even classic 12 steps and that sort of thing. So partnerships, collaborations, huge for us. And it's still the model that I want to make sure that we continue.
You mentioned some of the large organizations that are partners. Here's an opportunity for you to shout out to another category of partners, which is like your individual donors and people who help support Philly House. So talk about the funding for the Philly House, and also for the listeners, if they wanted to contribute to the Philly House's mission, how they would go about giving as well.
Yeah, so Philly House has been around for 146 years. Our primary source of revenue, still to this day, is individuals. So our direct mail campaign, and now, of course, this day and age, our social media, as well as our online contributions. So about 82% of all our revenue come from that. We don't rely upon government funding. And so our partnership with the Lincoln Center is our first kind of entrance into tapping into some of those funding sources, particularly here in the state. But up to the present, we really rely upon the generosity of God's people. Yeah. And it's individuals that write us $25 checks to be able to serve a few meals, all the way up to major donors that are big investors in everything we do. So the best way to be able to contribute and to be able to join us, of course, in this day and age, is going online at phillyhouse.org. Of course, finding our contact information. And we love giving tours. Oftentimes, just being able to come and serve a meal with us. So 365 lunches a year and 365 dinners a year, we need people to help serve those meals. And it's just the simple act of delivering a tray to a table to somebody that's hungry and hurting.
They can give financially, but they can also give their time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. If they're giving they're giving to help you accomplish your vision for the future of Philly House. What is that? What is your vision for the future of Philly House? And what about it excites you?
Yeah, one of our values is belonging. So one view that we take, even regarding poverty, as well as homelessness, comes from a book called When Helping Hurts. And so in that book, they study poverty alleviation strategies globally, and then they apply it to a North American context. And so in a lot of their global work that they've studied, poverty is really the result of broken relationships. Mm. And so as a Christian, we first and foremost say it's a broken relationship to God. Secondly, it's a broken relationship often with oneself. It's a broken relationship to society, and then it's a broken relationship to family, right? And so what excites me is to lead men and those experiencing homelessness into restoring and reconciling in those relationships. Yeah. And so family reunification is huge for us. We place those phone calls all the time of the guy who comes in often even from Kensington using drugs. And we placed a phone call to the mother in Texas. On one particular occasion, it was Houston, Texas, and she thought that her son was dead. Had completely given all hope because she hadn't heard from her son. What? Who are you? Ma'am, calling from Philly House. Just want to let you know we have your son here. I'm jumping in the car to come get him. No, ma'am, you don't have to do that. Calm down, right? There's a program in the city of Philadelphia in which they pay for a Greyhound bus ticket anywhere in the United States. Ma'am, I just need to confirm there's someone on the receiving end in Houston. He's going to be on a bus tomorrow. So it's stories like that excite me to help and helped that individual to restore that broken relationship. Oftentimes relationships aren't easy to be able to restore. And so the vision that we have at Philly House is to be able to help one to achieve stability and self-sufficiency by experiencing the life transformation and the power of the love of God. And so for us to provide a place to belong for men and for those experiencing homelessness that otherwise feel rejected and feel isolated and feel alone in this world, to help them to be able to reconnect to themselves and to God and to rebuild those relationships. I mean, that's what gets me up every day.
Just got one final question for you.
Yeah.
And it's in the context of what we were talking about earlier, of like the root cause, right? And we hypothesize that lack of leadership could be one of the reasons. Could be likely as one of the reasons. But we were talking in that context about leadership at kind of the national political level. But as you just mentioned out, it starts in the home. So, breakdown in the family, leadership in the home, but then leadership in your local communities as well. And so back to the cliche, it takes a village. It starts in the home, community support.
Yep.
And the national level, we need to make better leadership decisions as well. It's just all of that above. So the final question is this. For those listening, what's the one thing they can do to contribute to the village to make a difference in the fight against homelessness?
Yeah. One of the pieces of advocacy that we provide for people in terms of education is to share what we view to be our number one competitors. And so Philly House and the work that we do to address homelessness and hunger, one of our first competitors is the streets themselves, right? The vices, the lures, the independence, the autonomy, and which one experiences. So every day when people walk through our doors, we're competing against the streets. And again, everything that it provides often to these men, and we compete against that by ensuring there's absolutely no reason why one would want to return to the streets. Yeah. GT, our second competitor that we've been able to identify is what we refer to as do-gooders. Mm. And these are often the suburbanites that see the issues of homelessness even on the news, perhaps even when they come in to see a game, they see the guy laying on the grate, and they go to McDonald's, buy a bunch of hamburgers, and drive through the city looking under underpasses, or even these many are panhandling at the street corner, and they roll down the window. And I know a lot of people, you probably do too, who specifically carry bottles of water and gift cards and care kits in their car so that then when they come into the city, they roll down the window and they hand that out. For every do-gooder that does that, they provide that individual another night, perhaps another day, another week, another month. And they provide that individual the ability to stay on the streets and never have to come through our doors seeking our care and our shelter. Right.
So short-term Band-Aid versus a long-term solution.
Short-term Band-Aid. Yep. And so oftentimes then people say, well, then what do I do? What do I do when I encounter that guy literally on the stoop of my business and I just want to get in the door? First of all, be human. Introduce yourself. Hi, my name is Jeremy. What's your name? Treat him with human dignity and respect, but don't give out anything. And one can simply say, hey, nope, I'm not going to help you with that. I'm not going to give you a handout. I'm not going to give you money or what you're asking for because I support Philly House. Or I support St. John's, which is another shelter, Catholic shelter in Philadelphia. So find that organization that you support. So then with human dignity and respect, you can still offer that by saying, and hey, I know Philly House will provide you a meal like right now. Right now. And I give my support to them. Right. And so we have many wonderful people that hear that message, buy into it, and then we'll walk people to our door.
Wow.
Right. And to introduce them. And I do that. So I live in Old City. When I encounter people on the street, I look at them and say, you don't know who I am, do you? No. I'm the CEO of Philly House. Oh, they know Philly House, formerly called Sunday Breakfast Rescue Mission, right? And you understand I can change your life, right? You understand that?
So the call to action, just summarizing what you just said, the call to action for those listening is rethink how you engage with the homeless population, get familiar with the local organizations like the Philly House, and every urban area has a Philly House or something similar.
That's right.
Even the suburban area as well.
That's right.
And be prepared to help educate the person on all the services that are made available. Might be a little bit harder in the rural areas. And so for those who have done the research and there's not an organization nearby, this is a question that's asked a lot in the churches. How do you help those where there's not the village to help? What's your recommendation there?
Oh, yeah, the recommendation there.
That's a tough one.
It is a tough one. And there's another housing model called the Interfaith Hospitality Network. And so the national organization is called Family Promise. And what's cool about that network is they specifically focus on more rural environments by engaging churches to be the shelter. And so if you're a rural community, you know your county, your municipality lacks any resource, even reach out to Family Promise. It's a national network that allows you to be able to reach out to churches, engage churches where a church becomes a host for 1 week at a time. And so these are in Sunday school rooms. These are often in gymnasiums where you're able to then provide that temporary assistance to get people off the streets.
That's great information. I was not aware of that.
Yeah, so Family Promise, the original started in Plainfield, New Jersey, and I originally served on that board. And what it originally sought to do, and it was a group of clergy, both Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, that came together and said, hey, we have this asset that is empty 6 days of the week. And we can address homelessness by just opening up our facilities, cooking the meals, just by giving people a safe place. So it's a really cool model. And so definitely look into it. So there is definitely a call to action and opportunity there, supported by a national organization that can help to start that type of network in any community in the United States.
That's fantastic. So
it's cool, right?
Let's go back in time a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, what had first inspired you to dedicate your life to serving this population?
Yeah, it really goes back to when I was a junior in high school. I grew up in a Christian family, and my family made a lot of sacrifices to be in Christian ministry. And so I have to say I was reared to not want to do any of that in my life. And so for me, when I was 16 years old, a junior in high school, it really was for me to discover my own faith and my own belief in Jesus Christ as a Christian. And with that, it was a real distinct calling. God changed my life and changed the trajectory of where I was heading. I graduated top of my class of high school, and I could have gone to any college or university I wanted to on full ride scholarships, and I chose to go to a small Bible college and major in urban ministry. So very early on, I knew that God was calling me to be able to work in urban contexts, and that led me to go to seminary, Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary up in Boston, and also major in urban ministry because I wanted to be really effective practitioner. And so full circle being at Philly House, it's a fulfillment of my calling. Like I really feel like I was born for this.
Interesting. The name of the podcast is TLC Connections. And one of the common questions we ask every guest is to think back on a particular connection that they made at some point in the past that like significantly transformed like the trajectory of your life. Like, is there a particular moment in time that you can remember that you connected with someone, or perhaps you made a choice, or maybe someone else made a choice that started this ripple effect, what we refer to as the butterfly effect here at TLC, that moment in time rippled out and like significantly affected the trajectory of your life?
Yeah, a significant connection in my life that I would say in a butterfly effect that changed my trajectory. Even in the context of like, what prepares one to work with about a third of all the homeless dudes in the city of Philadelphia? What education goes into that, right? And in many respects, you can even call it the School of Hard Knocks. Well, my School of Hard Knocks, to answer your question, I would go back to when I was 10 years old. And my parents and my sister and we had a family meeting. And that family meeting was where we sat down and we recognized all the foster children that we saw coming in and out of the daycare. So at the time, my mom worked in a Christian daycare as an educator. At the time, my dad also worked at that Christian daycare. And so my parents just pointed out that all the kids that I even knew, because I was 10 years old attending that daycare, and my sister at that time would have been 13, had no home. And for them to name the names of these kids. And so when I was 10 years old, after that family meeting, we decided to become a foster family. And so to answer your question, it wasn't one individual. It ended up being over 100 brothers and sisters that I had from the age of 10 to the age of 18 when I finally left the house, right, to go into college. And my parents ended up being foster parents for 35 years.
Wow. So
35 years. And so they helped to foster hundreds. And so the evolution from the age of 10, even when I left at age of 18, we were always a family of 8. So we had 4 foster children at every given time. And the range of how many nights or how long some of these kids were my brothers and sisters could have been from one night as emergency respite, all the way to multiple years. Or then when they graduated from high school, turned 18, and they kind of aged out, as it's referred to.
How big was the house?
It was only a 4-bedroom house.
Okay.
So I shared a bedroom and a bunk bed until I was a senior in high school. So me becoming a senior in high school earned me to have my own bed finally.
How mature were you as a 10-year-old? Were you thinking, why can't I have my own bedroom?
Frankly, when I was at 10, it seemed really fun, right? Oh my gosh, I get to have another brother. I get to have another sister. And so when I was at 10, we only started with one kid. And so her name was Bev.
Okay.
So we started with a girl. So I didn't even have to share my bedroom at that point. But after Bev came very quickly, then we brought in Dan, right?
Yeah.
So Dan ended up being my first foster brother. And what's cool through all of it, I have to say, is my parents still visit Dan. Dan now is married and has his own children and lives in South Dakota, and my parents still live in Illinois. My parents are Dan's parents. And so growing up in that environment, that was the first introduction, is all these kids called my mom and dad, mom and dad. And we brought them into our family, and that's how we received them, right? And so, yeah, when I was 10, it was really cool.
Okay, what about by the time you got to teenager?
Yeah, by the time I got to be a teenager, and let's just say even continuing into my adult years, I've been through a lot of therapy now.
Okay.
Right?
Well, you were talking about
I've
trauma.
been through a lot of family. So I've had my own trauma. So we basically became, so what started out as a girl, then a boy, then we became, frankly, a treatment home for the state of Illinois, in which my parents received a lot of training to do the case management and oversight. So we got really hard cases that generally did not survive in group homes, or wasn't successful in an institutional setting. So these kids would be sent, into my bedroom for me to share with them. And so it was, I was subjected to every type of violence, abuse, theft.
You mean directly or vicariously through?
Directly.
Wow.
Directly. So physical fights. Often both my parents worked, and so 14-year-old kid, I was the one standing at the end of the driveway because a particular kid went AWOL, which meant just left, ran away. So I had to call the cops and report it, and I had every bit of knife held to my throat, and I can't tell you how many times my entire wardrobe was stolen by these kids, and I had a little lockbox in my closet.
I'm not even sure how to process this right now. So I didn't know any of this. We've
About
known each
me.
other. Yeah, we've known each other for a while.
Yeah.
I didn't know this.
Yeah.
How has that, so now as an adult, you're looking back on that.
Yep.
Would you put your own children through that?
That's an interesting question. I would say, so I just referred to the aspect that I've been through a lot of therapy myself to deal with those traumas. And so part of that is even me to come to terms with my parents being foster parents with foster kids around my own children. So some of my hardest conversations with my parents have been for me to insist that when my boys visited them, that they didn't have any foster kids around. So some of the hardest conversations I've had with my father, my mother, and this is just within recent years, right? So right now I have a 17-year-old and a 10-year-old. And so you imagine when my youngest son was 6 years old, my parents were still fostering, and they had an 8-year-old boy. And it was the hard conversation to say, Mom, Dad, when I bring my boys to come visit you during the summers, I don't want them to have the same experience I had. And I was subjected to a whole level of violence and abuse and attacks, physically, verbally, every bit. And I said, and I don't want my boys to be vulnerable to that, even that possibility. And so, it's been some hard roads. I mean, my parents, I've always described, are the best parents in the world. They're professional parents at loving these kids. In that environment, it was tough for me to swallow as an adult, for me to then say, but they were professional, good parents to everyone else, but
it's probably
their own son.
Probably a question for them.
Yep.
So I'm asking you to maybe put yourself in their place, but
yep.
It sounds like it would have probably been traumatic for them as well. Did you ever see their calling waiver?
A waiver.
Yeah.
No. For them, they were really kind of numb and deaf to my experiences. That was the hardest thing. Most of everything that I endured and I experienced, my parents were ignorant of and kind of blind to. They really kind of put a blind eye to it because they felt so committed and called to love and care for these kids.
Did you share some of those stories with them later as an adult?
Yeah.
And were they surprised that some of those things happened?
Yeah, shocked. Like they had no idea related to my own drug use when I was under their roof. I didn't share that with them until I was in my 30s. So I turned 50 this past year, and so it took me a long time to share those stories with them, because the other side of it too, GT, is back to your question about connections, right? Still to this day, I mean, I can't dismiss and deny these experiences because they formed and fashioned me into who I am.
Right.
It allows me to be able to handle every trauma and every story I hear from a homeless dude walking through my doors. And yes, I've heard it all because I've also experienced every bit of trauma and horror myself, right? And so nothing is shocking to me. And so the other side of it, I'm really proud of my parents. Like, it's been a badge of honor for me as well. But with that badge of honor, boy, you know, I have my own wounds.
Some parents, maybe many parents.
Yep.
Particularly, probably I would describe my wife and I, this was our parenting philosophy, is we wanted to protect our children, put them in a bubble, not let them see the real world until they were old enough, mature enough to process, as you said, the bad things that happen in this world. You were exposed to it at a very early age. Did that force you to grow up faster? Were you more mature than your peers?
Yes.
And how did that translate as you got older? Could you identify with a lot of your peers, or did you feel like you had so many experiences that were kind of beyond what they could even imagine? That just wondering how that shaped you.
Yeah. You know, interesting about that question, GT. I've never thought about it. Right. And so that's a great question. And I would say the first recognition or even self-awareness that I had a really rare, unique childhood was when I went to college. And I went to North Central Bible College in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and to discover peers and fellow students that came from all over the country. I mean, there were even missionary kids there, some even guys that, you know, roommates of mine that grew up overseas. And then realizing that the way I was raised was not normal. So even at that point, I didn't really think too much of it.
Because that's all you had ever known.
That's all I had never. Yeah, exactly. And you know, in the community that I grew up in, particularly the high school, I mean, you wouldn't call it an affluent community by any means. A lot of mobile home trailer parks, right? And I mean, that was essentially the high school that I attended at the time. And so I didn't really think anything of it until I went to college, and then kind of realized it. Yeah, I mean, it was. My experience was not the typical experience.
Yeah. You've mentioned Bible college. You've mentioned your faith. You mentioned your parents as Christians in ministry.
Yeah.
You were a reverend at one point.
Is
that
am.
correct?
Yeah, I still am. Yeah.
You are.
I'm still full ordination. Yep.
Yeah. So tell me, how did your journey go from post-college to Philly House? Like, what was in between?
In between was, as I said, starting doing gang intervention, Boston Public Schools, living in Boston for about 5 years, marrying the New Jersey girl that I met in Boston. And so she wanted to go to Rutgers University. So we got married, and she attended Rutgers to get her MSW. And at that time, I landed a job in her home church in Westfield, New Jersey. So I went from a very inner city, urban, call it even ghetto environment, to a wealthy suburban church at First Baptist Church of Westfield, where I served for 7 years. And so,
what role did you serve?
I was the associate pastor. So they first hired me to be the minister of local outreach because being a church of means, about 21% of their plate collections they gave away to missions and local organizations. So highly, highly charitable, very highly resourced. So they needed an associate pastor that was going to lead their efforts in local outreach and what ended up then going into global efforts. And so I served there for 7 years. And what that really taught me was how to relate to people of affluence and resource and wealth, especially coming from an inner city environment where I wasn't raised in that type of environment.
Right.
And really just kind of realizing it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, our basic human needs are the same. But I had to learn how to be comfortable in my own skin and equally in that environment, being the pastor of people who had a lot of even old school wealth and the lessons learned there, right? And so the story I tell all the time was the first time I had to bring communion to one of the shut-ins. And I didn't know that she was probably one of the wealthiest church members because when she came to church, you couldn't tell in terms of what she drove, in terms of how she dressed, until I visited her home and realized, whoa, like mansion, big, huge, stately home in Westfield, New Jersey. And so bringing her communion in that environment, but yet doing so on a human level, it really kind of, showed and demonstrated to me, again, whether rich or poor, our needs as humans are exactly the same. And to not be intimidated by that, because I was raised on the other side of the tracks.
Right.
Right. And I was raised even in a philosophy that, we ain't those folk on the other side of the track. And even to this day, carrying those lessons with the homeless guys I work with, and some of the lessons I conveyed to them is like, listen, don't let anything hold you back. I was raised in an environment that said there's many things I shouldn't have in my life. Like I shouldn't even have this nice jacket. And specifically, GT, one of the fun things I like to do at Philly House is I take these guys sailing. So I'm a sailor. We belong to a sailing club on the Delaware River. And to me, I was raised with a viewpoint that I shouldn't have access to something like sailing. That's for the wealthy. That's for the affluent. And for me to realize, no, like there should be nothing that holds us back from being able to pursue dreams, right? And to be able to do something that we enjoy. And so I bring these guys sailing and they're scared to death, right? They're scared to death. And at the end of it, I said, so listen, don't let your fear or your concern of the unknown ever hold you back, because you never know what you're going to find on the other side. So Westfield, New Jersey, ministering in that church really opened my eyes. From there, I worked for a international Christian NGO called World Relief.
Okay.
And so I was their Northeast Director of Church Relations doing fundraising, connecting wealthy churches to the needs of the global poor. So World Relief at that time had done work in 34 countries. So I got to go over to Rwanda, got to go over to Burundi and lead churches to be able to support other churches in the global work of World Relief. Well, that was 2008. You remember what happened in 2008? Yeah. And so I was laid off. Something to do with banking, housing. You were in banking at the time, housing. Yeah. So I was laid off, and so that was my dream job, is connecting churches all over the East Coast to the needs of the global poor. And then that led me to land a job in my backyard of Plainfield, New Jersey, because I was still Westfield, Scotch Plains, Fanwood up there with Habitat for Humanity. And so I spent about 8 years as an executive with Habitat, building houses for those that otherwise couldn't obtain the dream of home ownership. And then after Habitat, came here to Philadelphia for Philly House.
There's some common themes running through your story.
Yeah.
I guess what
do you see?
Yeah.
What themes?
No, this is about you. It's not about me.
Yeah, no, but what do you see?
I see a calling to serve what the scriptures refer to as the least of these.
Yes.
Those who are underprivileged, underserved, under-resourced. That theme is very obvious. And obviously your parents had a big influence on that. And I also see a housing thing, the basic, back to Maslow's hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
I see a focus on that, the bottom rung, the basic needs, water, food, shelter, and then the next one up, safety. So, Jeremy, thank you so much for your time.
Yep.
Very excited for you to be here. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day. Philly House is a great organization. And to learn more, again, Jeremy, you go where? phillyhouse.org?
phillyhouse.org.
All right.
That's right, because Philly is in the house.
You have a great day. You have a great day, Jeremy.
GT, thanks for having me. You're a great partner to Philly House as well, and really appreciate the opportunity to share my story as well as the story of Philly House. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you. All right.
TLC Connections is supported in part by the Lincoln Center for Family and Youth. Through education, counseling, coaching, and consulting, we empower people to make positive choices, meaningful connections, and transformational change. To learn more, visit thelincolncenter.com.